Sometimes I think the barn at Willow Creek was the only place where I really felt like myself. It's strange to say, but it's true. Life at home always felt quiet, predictable, like I was just moving through the motions. My husband, Ethan, worked a demanding corporate job that had him traveling constantly. He was a good man, dependable, but his world seemed so far removed from mine. Our house sat on a piece of land tucked far away from the noise of the city, surrounded by open fields and the steady hum of nature. To most people, it probably seemed like the perfect, peaceful escape, but to me, there were days when the silence felt too heavy. That's where the barn came in. It became my escape, my safe space when everything else felt too still. We had horses for as long as I could remember, mostly because Ethan loved them. He liked the idea of keeping them, cared for them like they were a hobby, something practical to balance his hectic work life. But for me, the horses felt like something more, especially Orion. He was a strong, beautiful chestnut gelding with a deep gaze that seemed to watch everything quietly. I hadn't thought much about him at first. He was always friendly, always gentle, but back then, I saw him the same way I saw everything else on the property, just another part of the routine. That all changed over time, though, especially when Ethan's business trips became more frequent, leaving me alone in the house for days, sometimes weeks. One evening, after yet another long day by myself, I wandered out to the barn without thinking. I'd done it plenty of times before, feeding the horses, checking on them. But that night felt different. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that settles deep in your chest. The barn smelled like hay and earth, familiar and calming. Orion stood quietly in his stall, his chestnut coat glowing faintly in the dim light. I walked over to him, expecting nothing special, but when I reached out to stroke his neck, something inside me eased. It was like the weight I'd been carrying all day. The loneliness, the emptiness, suddenly felt a little lighter. I didn't say much, just ran my hand along his mane, but standing there beside him felt like breathing again. From that night on, I found myself going back to the barn more often. It became part of my routine, something I looked forward to in a way I hadn't expected. Every time Ethan packed his bags and left for another trip, I felt that familiar ache settle in, and without fail, I'd end up at Willow Creek stable, brushing Orion's coat, talking softly to him, just being near him. He didn't need me to fill the silence with words. He simply stood there, steady and calm, and it made me feel like I belonged somewhere. Over time, I realized the barn wasn't just a place to pass the time anymore. It was my refuge, my little corner of the world where I didn't have to explain how I felt or pretend everything was fine. Orion didn't ask questions or expect anything from me. He just stood there, present, and that was enough. I didn't know it at the time, but those quiet moments in the barn would become more important than I ever imagined. Looking back now, it's clear how much comfort I found in those evenings, how much I relied on that connection without even realizing it. The barn, the horses, Orion, they became the one place where everything felt still, where I didn't have to be anyone but myself. And in a life where so much felt routine and distant, that kind of peace meant everything. The more time I spent out at Willow Creek Stable, the more I realized how much I needed those moments with Orion. What started as a way to fill the silence whenever Ethan was away slowly became something deeper, something I looked forward to more than anything else. Every morning when I woke up alone, and every evening when the house felt too empty, I found myself drawn back to the barn. It wasn't just about caring for the horses anymore. It was about the peace I felt when I was with Orion, the quiet comfort of knowing he was always there, steady and constant in a life that felt anything but. At first, I told myself it was normal. After all, Animals have always had a calming effect on people, right? But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. I started rearranging my days just to make sure I had extra time at the barn. I'd find excuses to linger longer after brushing him down or cleaning his stall. I loved the way he'd nuzzle me gently, the way his big brown eyes seemed to understand things I couldn't say out loud. It felt like he could see straight through me, past all the layers I kept up around everyone else. He didn't care if I was lonely or frustrated or restless. He just accepted me exactly as I was. There were days when I barely noticed the hours slipping by. I'd sit in the corner of his stall or lean against the stable door, talking softly to him about anything and everything. Things I couldn't bring myself to share with anyone else came spilling out without hesitation. How disconnected I felt from Ethan lately, how empty the house felt when he was gone, how tired I was of pretending everything was okay. Orion never answered, of course, but somehow that made it easier. He just listened, his ears flicking as I talked, his steady breathing grounding me in a way no one else could. I started to notice how my mood shifted when I wasn't with him. The house felt heavier. My days felt longer. It was like there was a weight pressing on my chest that only eased when I was out in the barn, close to Orion. I didn't want to admit it at first, but I realized I was depending on him more than I ever had. It wasn't just about taking care of the horses anymore. It was about needing that connection, needing the calm and reassurance his presence gave me. Looking back, it's easy to see how much my life had started to revolve around those moments at Willow Creek. It felt like every part of my day was just me waiting to get back to the barn, to feel that quiet peace settle over me again. And the more time I spent with Orion, the more I realized that I felt something with him that I couldn't find anywhere else. Not at home, not in my marriage, not even in the routines I used to think made me happy. He became more than a horse to me. He became the one place I felt safe, understood, and completely at ease. And I don't think I really understood how much I needed that until I found myself unable to stay away. It's hard to say exactly when things started to change between me and Orion. For a long time, everything felt natural, easy. Just me spending time in the barn, brushing him, talking to him, enjoying his calm presence. But then, little by little, there was a shift. Nothing dramatic or sudden, just small, almost unnoticeable moments that started to feel different. It wasn't just about feeding him or cleaning his stall anymore. It became about how I felt when I was near him, how much I craved those quiet moments where it was just the two of us. I'd linger a little longer after finishing my chores, running my hand down his neck more slowly, letting my fingers trace the line of his mane. I told myself it was nothing, just a habit, part of the routine. But I could feel something deeper growing, something that wasn't there before, and it made me stop and question myself more than once. I think part of it had to do with how things felt at home. Every time Ethan came back from one of his trips, it was like there was this invisible wall between us. We'd talk, make small conversation, go through the motions, but the closeness we used to have felt like it had faded. I didn't know how to bridge that gap, didn't even know if he noticed how distant I felt. But in the barn, with Orion, there were no awkward silences or expectations. It was just simple, steady, and comforting. And maybe because of that, I let my guard down more with him than I did with anyone else. I started paying attention to the way Orion responded to me, too. It felt like he understood every shift in my mood, every thought I didn't say out loud. He'd lean into me when I was feeling low, nudge me gently when I needed grounding. And somewhere along the way, I found myself leaning into him more. Not just physically, but emotionally. I noticed how close I was standing, how often I reached out to touch his muzzle or run my fingers through his mane. It was as if being near him filled a space inside me that had been empty for a long time, and I didn't want to step away. One afternoon stands out in my memory. I had finished riding, and instead of heading straight back to the house like I usually did, I stayed. The sun was starting to set, casting everything in that soft, golden light. Orion stood quietly beside me, his breathing slow and steady, and I found myself resting my hand on his shoulder longer than usual. I could feel his warmth, feel the solid strength of him beneath my fingertips, and something in me didn't want to let go. It wasn't anything physical or dramatic. It was more of an emotional pull, a longing I didn't quite understand at the time. It's strange how easy it is to blur lines without realizing it. One moment, things feel simple, harmless, and then the next, you catch yourself wondering if maybe you've crossed into new territory without meaning to. That's what it felt like with Orion. The boundaries of trust and comfort slowly shifted, and I started to question where the line even was. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining it, but deep down, I knew something had changed. After that afternoon, it became harder and harder to ignore what I was feeling. I kept telling myself that nothing was different, that I was just imagining things, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Every time I walked into the barn, there was this strange energy hanging in the air, like something unspoken was always sitting right beneath the surface. I couldn't shake the feeling, no matter how much I tried. I started noticing every little detail about Orion, the way his ears perked up when he heard my footsteps, how he'd lean in just slightly when I ran my hands down his neck, how his eyes always seemed to find mine and hold there longer than before. It wasn't just about the comfort anymore. It felt heavier, like there was something else building quietly between us. The more time I spent in the barn, the harder it was to pretend it was all innocent. I'd stand beside him longer than necessary, brushing the same spot over and over, letting my hand linger on his coat. There were times when I caught myself leaning into him just to feel the solid weight of him, to feel something steady and real. I knew I was depending on him in a way I hadn't before, not just for peace or routine, but for something deeper, something I couldn't quite put into words. It felt like there was this invisible thread pulling me closer to him, and I couldn't, or maybe didn't want to, pull away. At home, the gap between me and Ethan kept growing. He'd come back from his trips and try to pick up where we left off, but it felt forced. He'd ask how things were, how the horses were doing, but the conversations felt shallow, like we were both going through the motions. I didn't know how to explain why I felt so distant, so disconnected. I wanted to close that gap, but every time I tried, it felt like there was a part of me that had already drifted too far away. Meanwhile, in the barn, everything felt effortless. I didn't have to think or explain myself. I could just be there, quiet, steady, letting the presence of Orion fill whatever emptiness I felt inside. But as comforting as it was, I knew the lines were blurring. There were moments when I'd realize how tightly I was holding on to him, how much I craved those quiet evenings when it was just me and him. I started to wonder if I had crossed some kind of line, not in actions, but in feelings, and that scared me. I kept trying to convince myself it was harmless, that I was just lonely and Orion was filling a void, but deep down, I knew it had become more than that. The emotional lines between companionship and something else had started to blur, and the more I tried to push it away, the stronger it seemed to grow. Every look, every touch, every moment spent in the barn felt charged, and no matter how much I told myself to pull back, I kept finding reasons to go back to him. It wasn't something I could ignore anymore, and that realization left me both comforted and unsettled at the same time. It wasn't long before the distance between me and Ethan became impossible to ignore. I had spent so much time convincing myself that everything was fine, that I was handling things. But deep down, I knew the space between us had grown too wide. Every time he came back from one of his trips, it felt like we were strangers in the same house. We still talked, went through the usual routines, dinner, small conversations, the occasional shared laugh, but it all felt surface level, like we were just two people playing roles rather than actually connecting. And every time he looked at me, I wondered if he could see how far away I felt. The truth was, my mind was never fully present when he was home. Even when we sat together on the couch or shared a meal, part of me was back at Willow Creek Stable, thinking about Orion, about the quiet moments I had grown to depend on. It wasn't something I could easily explain, even to myself. I kept telling myself it was harmless, that I was just filling the empty space in my life while Ethan was gone. But eventually, I couldn't deny it anymore. The emotional pull I felt toward Orion wasn't just about the barn being a peaceful escape. It had become something more, something I hadn't planned for, but couldn't shake. One evening, after Ethan returned from another business trip, the tension hanging between us felt thicker than ever. He sat across from me at the dinner table asking about my week, how things had been while he was away. I answered the same way I always did, mentioning the usual things, avoiding anything too deep. But I could feel his eyes on me, searching for something. It was like he knew without me having to say it. He didn't press, but the silence after our conversations felt heavier, stretched out longer than before. I could feel the questions lingering between us, unspoken, but there all the same. I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had gotten to this point. I thought back to the early days of our relationship, before the routines and the business trips, back when everything felt simpler. I wanted to get back to that, to find a way to close the gap, but I didn't know how. The more I tried to pretend nothing had changed, the more I felt like I was slipping further away from him. And every time I thought about pulling myself back, the memory of Orion, the calm, steady presence I'd grown to rely on, was there, making it harder to face the reality in front of me. I knew something had to give. I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was wrong, couldn't keep hiding how much I'd drifted emotionally. It felt like I was living two different lives, the quiet one at the stable, where I felt understood without words, and the one at home, where everything felt disconnected. And as much as I tried to keep them separate, the lines between the two were starting to blur in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. It was only a matter of time before everything caught up with me. I think deep down, I always knew that. You can only bury your feelings for so long before they start to spill over, whether you want them to or not. For weeks, I'd been walking this line, trying to keep one foot in my normal life with Ethan and the other in the quiet world I had built out at Willow Creek Stable. I thought I could balance it, thought I could keep those two parts of myself separate. But slowly, they started bleeding into each other, and eventually, there was no keeping them apart. Ethan noticed before I was ready to admit it. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way his questions came a little softer, but a little more serious. He was trying to understand why I felt distant, why it seemed like I was slipping further away every time he came home. But how could I explain it? How do you put into words something you don't fully understand yourself? One evening, after dinner, he asked me directly. He didn't accuse me of anything, didn't raise his voice. He just asked, "Is there something going on?" I felt my chest tighten, my throat dry. I wanted to say no to reassure him, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I just stared down at my plate, avoiding his eyes, because I knew the truth wasn't something I could easily share. It wasn't about another person. It wasn't something physical. But the feelings I had, the emotional weight of it all, felt just as heavy. I'd wrapped so much of myself up in those quiet moments at the barn, leaning on Orion in ways I hadn't even realized until it was too late. And now, sitting there with Ethan, I felt the full weight of what I'd been doing. The silence between us stretched on, uncomfortable and thick. I knew he deserved honesty. But how do you tell someone that you've found comfort and connection somewhere else, even if it's not in the way people usually expect? I felt ashamed, not because I had done anything physical, but because I had let my heart wander. I had built an entire world outside of our marriage, a world where I felt seen and understood, and that realization hurt more than anything. That night, after Ethan went to bed, I stood by the window and stared out at the dark fields leading to Willow Creek stable. Everything felt heavy. My guilt, my confusion, the distance I'd created between us. I thought about Orion, about how easily I had slipped into depending on him, how natural it had felt to pour all my emotions into that quiet space with him. But now I was left wondering if I'd let that need get too strong, if I'd leaned so hard into that comfort that I forgot how to fix what was right in front of me. Facing the truth wasn't easy. I knew I had to make a choice, to either keep pretending or finally face the consequences of what I'd been feeling. It wasn't just about the barn or the time spent away from home. It was about realizing that somewhere along the way, I had stopped showing up fully in my own life, and that was something I couldn't ignore anymore.